Folks, welcome to the Amity Foundation Circle Tree Ranch. This is the Jake Feinberg Show. We are live here. It's early in the morning, and we're joined by Dr. George DeLeon, who has really dedicated his life over the last 7 decades to recovery-oriented systems for people that are dealing with addictions. Dr. George DeLeon, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's great to be here. Great to meet you, man. I wanted, one of the L's on my program is love. And when I watch your speeches, you know, I've never seen you in person live to, you know, give a seminar, but I'd like you to talk about your concept of love and how much love has driven you on this mission that you've been on in creating these recovery-oriented rehabilitation centers.
Well, if it's the word love, the first association I have to that word was whatever way I was trying to first love myself. And then, clearly then, in terms of the social circle of people that I knew, the early street musicians, and the damage to them in their lives. Even though I managed to avoid that damage in terms of drug use and so forth, but the damage to them, and they're gradually getting lost, whether they were musicians or not musicians. You know, even before I became a psychologist or anything, I'm talking early on, because I've been playing music since I'm 13, but early on, it was the seeing the way they lost their way that began to register, if you want to reconceptualize that as love, had meaning for me.
Mm-hmm.
My caring for them, my fear for them, my fear for myself. And it's, I think, that side of my sensibility that has persisted in not only a little bit in my music, hopefully, but certainly in my main work. I guess in the end, it's the elements of compassion, the elements of empathy. So that, for me, people being in trouble, and we'll maybe talk more about it, mainly drug addiction and those who are suffering from that was never far away from me, even though that I was not a specific victim of that. I could understand who they were, where they were.
So you yourself never dealt with addiction?
Yeah, as an addict.
Well, no. So this is fascinating because we'll just take heroin for instance. In the 40s, it was extremely prevalent. When I did this I'm doing this film documentary on Stan Getz, and all 4 brothers were hooked on it. And I'm just wondering, from your point of view, you know, it was very easily accessible. And were they using it?
Well, which years are you talking about? So
like late 40s.
Late 40s, okay.
And so, you know, what I'm getting at is that this was a way of life for these guys. And I'm curious as to, musically, when you started to get out on the bandstand. How early did you get out on the bandstand?
Well, you want to be a little bit more specific about these words. Bandstands are bands. Most of my playing had to do with small groups.
Let's talk about this.
Big bands, you know, and in clubs and in jazz clubs, and most of it was sitting in. I did not create a full-time jazz profession.
I get it, but I do. Did you go to Birdland? I mean, were you?
Oh yeah, all the New York scenes, and played in most of those scenes, in most of those venues. Some of the times working there, but most of the time sitting in.
I guess here's the right question.
Okay.
For these cats, especially in the late 40s, early 50s, in the Bebop scene, a lot of the cats that I talked to, David Amram is one of them. Now, he never did it, but he said that it was part of because of Bird. Because of Bird, a lot of cats felt like the only way that they could transcend and really play that kind of incredible, because he was so far ahead of everybody, and still is in some ways, that they needed to be a junkie. How much of being a junkie had to do with the jazz lifestyle, being in that sense?
Well, it certainly began to pervade among players. Prior to the heroin epidemic, the drug of choice was marijuana and alcohol for the players. So it's always been true that some kind of intoxicants are involved in jazz playing, swing playing, all the way back to the first parts of the century. And the larger question then, and then we can get back to the specifics of the heroin, the larger question was, what's the association between, altered states with you getting intoxicated and somehow trying to play and live some kind of a jazz life? And you got some obvious triggers for that. If you live a music life, jazz life, road life, that's a kind of isolation trigger. You're not connected. If you're only playing and you're not really cultivating all sides of the brain, you understand, you're going to be understimulated. If you're also somehow on the road, not living conventional lives, there's probably some elements of depression and some elements of inner disturbance. So you had the inclination among certainly jazz players and many in the disadvantaged community for being attracted to substances of all kinds. Then comes the heroin epidemic, a little bit later. So I'm not surprised, and you shouldn't be surprised, even from a historical perspective, that we move from something like marijuana or alcohol, and now you begin to see jazz musicians and all kinds of players getting seriously involved with heroin, the king drug, at that point. The reason why I say you shouldn't be surprised about it is because you have to look at the whole trajectory of waves and epidemics of substance use. When finally heroin gets accepted at all, and Bird might have been one of the iconic figures, but there were others, not just him. Once it gets accepted at all, then it's going to have pervasive effects, and as you can see now, much beyond jazz music. Mm-hmm. You got drugs. Once it breaks a threshold of acceptance, for reasons that we maybe can't get into here, but once it breaks that acceptance threshold, then it's pervasive. It's no longer targeted to the jazz musicians. You seem to be fascinated, and I understand why. Like, say, the four brothers, right? You got four white guys, you understand, who were all caught up, and others, and many white jazz musicians got caught up in heroin. And that partly just reflected the fact that the typical triggers that I just kind of went over with you a few moments ago, as well as the kind of theatrical effects of a Yardbird, using it and trying to emulate, and so on. But I now looking, as I say, if you look back at it from a longer trajectory, you can see this was the beginning, 40s, 50s, and 60s, of the pervasive rise of substance abuse, what I call the enculturation of substance abuse.
Can you define enculturation for the audience?
Increasing, to encultures to take over essentially norms, right, and values and ways of behaving. One culture essentially takes that on and learns that. Part of what we all learned, beginning in the 40s and 50s, moving from alcohol as one kind of accepted substance to a society that uses all kinds of substances. And this is enculturations, wider array of substances, wider cafeteria, more class levels using it from lower, middle, and upper, and younger onset of use. Those are the three indices of enculturation of drug use. That has been much beyond jazz music now. That's the society.
Did you feel, again, going back to the research that I've done 4 interviews for this film doc, and mm-hmm. Did you feel in your years, you were in your teenage years, into your young adult years, a lot of cats said that if you weren't on junk, then you weren't trusted. You were outside of the club.
There was some of that in group.
Did you feel that? Did you see that firsthand?
No, I didn't experience that. But I knew that. But it's a fair hypothesis that did go on in some subgroups. It's a typical. Early on, it was an in-group behavior, but it gradually became a wider group behavior. Mm-hmm. So it's correct, but I don't think it's as profound as at first blush.
Dr. George DeLeon, such an honor. We're attracting a huge audience here on Facebook Live. Tell me about the impact of one of those mercurial four brothers that you wanted to talk about. Not Zoot now, but who was the one that had the impact on you?
Well, it's a great young tenor player then by the name of Alan Eager. You know
Don't
that
know
name?
that name.
Don't know that
No,
name.
let's break down Alan Eager.
But all the rest of the brothers knew Alan Eager.
I'm sure.
And he was not one of those four, but he was one of the white tenor players, that emerging group, which is the four brothers, Al Cohn,
Serge Cherloff.
Serge was baritone player.
Barry sax, right?
And so, but Alan knew all of them, and they had played together in other venues. And it was really Alan that became a friend of mine, or I became a friend of his, and who was very, very encouraging to me at that time. I was maybe 18, 19 years old, and he was one of the young phenoms playing. And here, if you don't want to direct the conversation, I'll free associate around it.
Riff, man. Yeah.
There was a place in New York, right around 1950, called the Open Door, West 4th Street in the Village. It was one of the first venues. Largely it was a jazz venue, but the emphasis was kind of bebop. Bird would come in and play, essentially unbooked. He would just come in and play, but everybody would be in there. Horace Silver would play, and I hope some of the names come back to me rapidly. But
Dizzy was Diz there?
No, Dizzy was not there. But as far as but Arthur Farmer, I remember that.
Our Farmer, yeah, that's unbelievable.
So, and as some of these names come, but they all appeared there. But it was a place. It was like a big barn, but Bob Reisner was the producer of that, guy by the name of Bob Reisner. And Eager was also somebody who would sit in there. So Alan Eager was 15 years old when he hit the jazz scene and became known. His recordings began already at age 16 and 16 and a half.
What kind of horn did he play?
Tenor too?
Played a tenor.
Tenor.
Yeah, tenor saxophone. And this was the descendants, Eager, and then Getz, and Zoot, and Al Cohn. These were all descendants from the Lester Young.
Absolutely. I was just going to ask you about Coleman Hawkins versus...
that's the Hawkins, Ben Webster school, Don Byas, Lucky Thompson, that school. But this was the descendant from the Lester Young
Prez.
School. Prez. All the white Prezes, Lester Young used to call everybody Prez. He would call you Prez.
No, that's he.
Yeah, so, even though he was the Prez.
The white Prezes, yeah. No, yeah.
So, and I'm in the last analysis, I consider myself in that genealogy, of the Lester Young. But Eager, of course, was one of the really beautiful players in that school, and he was very encouraging to me because when he heard me play, and I can't remember exactly where and when he first heard me play, but whatever that was, he was quite encouraging to me, and I was still. Back then, I was still very uncertain about whether I could play A, well enough, and B, whether I wanted to even continue playing. So his influence on me at that time was important because it was an affirmation that here I was, fairly young, and he was telling me, you're really playing very well. And then recommended or suggested that I come down to the Open Door, which is where I spent a couple of years on Sundays, every Sundays playing there. And that was the first venue that gave me the opportunity to virtually be playing with everybody who was playing in that era. Even though it was not a book job.
Absolutely, it was a jam.
It was a jam, but I was in there every Sunday. Jackie McLean becomes another name.
About the Jones brothers, like Hank Jones or Thad Jones or
Hank Jones. And I'm trying to think now. It's terrible. I can't remember.
No, it'll come back.
I hope so. Wonderful. But I have to tell you, and as part of this discussion, at least I want to have some fun in this discussion. So this is also partly for me.
We're jamming, man.
It was in this setting where I was getting all of the feedback and the affirmation and some of the constructive criticism around playing at the Open Door with all of these players.
Could you give an example of the constructive criticism they would give you?
Well, it was all about knowing tunes. You had to. This was the era in jazz where you had to learn all the standard tunes, and you didn't read them. You didn't need to read them. You could read, but you didn't need to read them, and it was not expected that you read them. So that every tune that was going to be called, you would know.
And you played in any key, right?
In any key.
That's very key. Part of the part.
Yeah, any key. And so, in many ways, that's where people practiced, through these in doing that and getting better and better at that. So that was a profound setting, for me that launched me into a real opportunity to cultivate a career in jazz. But then there are some important individual issues that came up.
Go ahead.
Which began to affect the whole path that I was on. Both of the key ones were probably some of the failures I had then. So although I was playing well and in various sit-in venues playing with everybody, when I actually had to begin moving toward a professional commitment, I'm living that life, so to speak, as a 100% life.
As a jazzer.
As a jazzer. There I experienced some reservations and some fears. I never stopped playing, but I had those, and part of the reservation and part of the fears was the very issue that you're talking about. Here I am, around 20 years old, and drugs, and particularly heroin, is a big issue, and it's kind of an identified element in jazz life. And I was afraid of it. The whole idea of slipping into that life, you know what I mean? And although there were no direct pressures on me to do that, some of the issues that you alluded to earlier about in-group, out-group, were evident, and I had the concern about whether I could really resist that. Not because it was so attractive to me, but whether I'd be able to resist some kind of pressures around this or some kinds of expectations around this. So that was one reservation, one kind of psychological factor.
What can you talk about? Even though there was no quote unquote verbal overt pressure, you still felt pressure because of the. Can you go a little bit deeper?
Well, if you go into just some social settings, some jam sessions, people getting high, right, and there's some expectation. Everybody was smoking pot. I didn't even do that very much. I did it a little bit, but not very much. But to get high and then finally shoot dope itself, So there was just activity. If you're going to go into a particular setting, there'd be some activity.
I dig.
And I kept my distance from it. Partly because of the fear that I just talked about. There was something fearful about it. But also because there was another part of my personality, which ultimately I think kind of remanifested itself in my professional work in psychology and the work that I did. It looked kind of immature to me, foolish. Even though I was in years, their age, maybe a few years younger. So and then the third and associated feature, and I want to say this because it's important for, I think, certain people who might have problems in life to hear it. I had an advantage because my mother was essentially, at that point, kind of non-functional. She was okay in good health, but she didn't work, and in effect, I had to support her. And here I'm a young guy supporting a parent. But that turned out to be a very, very important restraining element. The fact that somebody needed me and depended upon me. So it was not only me, am I going to go out on the road and start to live a life and whatever happens, or whether it's music or drugs and so on, someone else could be a casualty of that.
That creates a lot of pressure too.
Well, I didn't feel it as pressure. In a way, it was, as I come to, I think, more fully understand, kind of central to maturing. People need you, and if you respond to that, it has its own kind of guiding and structural supports for you. You're not alone. You can't simply run off in the world and do whatever you want to do, thinking that there'll be no consequences or effects on other people, even if you feel there's none on you. And this was and this finally gets translated when people have children. We know now in drug addiction the meaning of parents and children and all that. So one of this element that I'm now talking about was very clearly a conscious one for me. My life, being a full-time jazz musician, going off into the sunset and whatever, when all the trappings of that, was not an easy path for me because of these dynamics that I'm talking about.
You are articulating it beautifully. I do want to clear up one more thing, is that a lot of people that I've talked to that spent time with
People like Train, Bird,
Right.
they were on the bandstand as we'll figure that out later, but in the small group context, they were on the bandstand 6-7 nights a week,
Yeah,
playing
that's
4 or
right.
5 sets a night.
That's right.
There were no arthritis medicine. These guys had arthritis. They had their joint pains. So, today we have, pills that are prescribed for pain.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, they were using heroin for. Is there truth that they were
There
using?
is some truth to that. Not only emotional and maybe even some mental stresses, but these physical aches and pains and the high demands of that lifestyle.
Yeah, we're getting great comments here on Facebook Live. You are doing. So another L on my show is life. What I mean by life is overcoming adversity. Can you talk about it specifically when you first got addicted to heroin? That kind of how you not overcame it, but can you pinpoint a time when you felt like you were really fighting it and how you overcame it?
We have to correct that. I never got involved in heroin.
Never heroin.
Never.
Let's clear it. So just talk about a time in that early phase where you were looking at the trappings of the bebop, the jazzer
Yeah.
life, having to support your mom, when you really began to find yourself going into the abyss. When was the first time you faced true adversity, and
How did you overcome it?
Well, if we're talking about adversity and my adversity,
your adversity?
yeah, we have to rule out drug addiction. That was not
Never.
not
Okay.
a problem.
Never. Okay.
I never got involved in this for the reasons I've hoped I've been making clear.
No experimentation. Nothing.
Smoking some pot, you know what I
Yeah,
mean.
yeah.
Drinking socially, you know what I mean. By age 21, whatever experimenting I did beyond what I just mentioned, all stopped anyway. By age 21.
By age
Yeah,
21.
So drugs, and those were never an issue. for me.
Unbelievable. Okay. All right.
And I'm hoping that's why I kind of free associated around some of these factors that it is my understanding what contributed to my immunity to drug addiction, and I want people to hear that, because I think science is beginning to bear some of that out. It starts as an individual experience, but some of the science is beginning to bear some of that out.
Was there
Some of the immunity factors.
no, this is very clear. Was there a demarcation point when you said, I'm going off into psychiatry?
Okay, that's good. That's it. To talk about some of those markers. That's good.
Big
That's
markers,
good.
yeah.
So I actually continued to play, you know what I mean, and in a more reduced way. And many of the venues in New York City with many of the players, usually, and some of them were gigs. Most of them were in sitting in. The other setback, I said I had fears, and one of the other influences on, I think, minimizing how much I was going to pursue 100% of jazz life was the early failures. I remember sitting in at a club called Georgie Auld Club. You remember Georgie Auld, the saxophone player and band leader? Georgie Auld had a club in there.
Oh, AULT.
AULD.
I did, yeah.
AULD. And I remember we would go to the Georgie Auld's club, and for some reason, one night when I went to that club to sit in, because that was a kind of a special sit-in place. You had to be a player to really sit in there. And they asked me to do it, and it didn't go well for reasons that I still don't fully understand, but they are probably all around performance anxiety, some kind of performance anxiety.
On your behalf?
On my behalf.
Yeah, okay.
So, having that experience registered for me, and then a related experience, which was not as dark as that one, but one that I didn't take very well. Now, this is the side of my personality that I can understand, is how well I can take setback and how well I could take failure at that age and at that time. Eager was on the Buddy Rich band, and it was a terrific band. And he was encouraging me. He said, "Why don't you come on that band? You know, at least why don't you try out for that
The
band?"
big band.
He was the big band.
Uh-huh.
He was the primary tenor player, called second tenor, first alto, second tenor. He said, "Why don't you play fourth tenor, which is, you know, 4 saxes and that, and the baritone player." So he convinced me and arranged for me to audition for the Buddy Rich band, and in the studio, and the whole band was there, and Buddy was there, and he was playing also. And that audition for me, I felt did not go well again. You know, even though I seemed to play all right. Alan felt I played well, but you know, some of the charts, I wasn't reading them as well as I could have, and I think some of that again was the performance anxiety contributing to some of that.
It's fascinating stuff.
So now, what's important about that is that so I didn't make the band. You know, plain and simple. You know, the pluses and minuses came across. People heard what I played like and how I soloed and how I sounded in the section, but for reasons maybe not reading it as well and so on. But I didn't take that very well, and that was another kind of sign for me that I had to pay attention. That as much as I had a passion for playing and I want to continue to playing, I wasn't completely certain that I could make it work, that I could really count on myself to be a 6-night-a-night performer, you know what I mean, and make it in some big way, you know. So that's actually the real story.
This is we got a comment in here. Someone said, "Could someone please share the name of this wonderful elder?" Dr. George DeLeon, as we were talking to right now. Now, was it just the idea that? Could you ever feel, was it merely being on the bandstand that was the performance anxiety? Could you ever talk, I guess, to put a cap on the jazz part, could you talk about one of the most transcendent experiences, like a beautiful experience where, you know, a light was shining when you just felt that you reached this point of a state of beautiful bliss? You know, on the bandstand, because what you're talking about is you weren't necessarily comfortable. You had maybe a low self-concept. You couldn't read as well, but you were actually playing okay. But you really inside didn't feel that. Mm-hmm. Was there a time where could you point to even at any point when there was a seminal moment for DeLeon on the bandstand?
Well, not a seminal moment, but I'll tell you why it's a very valid question. If this conversation doesn't get too circuitous, but let me tell you how I respond to that. 2021, I just recounted some of the setback situations that contributed to my enthusiasm about going forward as 100% jazz player. There was this other side. It starts from simply need. I was raised in poverty, had to support a mother, so I wasn't really just free to just run off. But also this whole other side of me that kind of the left brain, right brain. There was other things that were interesting me. The jazz life, the jazz social scene was limited in my experience. It's not people that I could fully identify with, hang out 24 hours a day. It wasn't part of it. There were the few important friends. There were all the people I played with, all the players, which were playing with the players. Those were wonderful moments, you know what I mean? And that went on all of my life. I'll come back to that, but that point. But you talk about a seminal moment, but it's not a seminal moment. It's really a kind of a continually developing process of change. Once I began to acknowledge that there were other needs in my life, other things that I had to cultivate, somehow make a difference in life, and that then by age 22 began to bring me back to going to school. I had been finished high school, but then was out. But then by 22, I began to start to take some courses and so on. And by 26, I became a kind of full-time college student. And then by 32, I had my doctoral degree and so on. So I began to cultivate that whole path. Now all along that path, I was always playing.
Right.
And I was playing in, again, most of the time sitting in an occasional.
Oh, this is
paid
unbelievable. So alongside academia, you were playing bebop and
always playing. Now,
then cool jazz as well. I mean, this is unbelievable.
Yes. Now let me tell you in terms of your question, not a seminal moment, but as I began to experience the accomplishment of what I was doing, namely that I could set goals and actually meet them. Here I full-time college at 26. That's certainly not the rule, you know. And by 32 had finished 3 degrees at Columbia University that I paid for. That pathway was increasing my confidence in life and increasing my confidence in playing. So as I essentially began to experience what I can really do in my life, it reduced most of the anxiety in all areas of my life.
This is about finding your true nature.
I guess
okay.
You want to frame it that way.
You know, I think this is. Were you? Did you wind up with becoming close with any of the beat poets or any of the cats that were there? Because a lot of those guys. Well, anyway, they were right in that whole scene. There was a West Coast scene, and then there was
that's a longer story. All the interactions I had with not only all the jazz players and which continued through my life, but all in other areas of entertainment. My brother was in show business, so that exposed me to a lot of entertainers and comics, and I lived with. When I was going to graduate school and earning my way through that, I had to work, and I worked in the roofing and siding business during those years. You're talking about now the mid-20s, mid to late 20s, and a guy by the name of Jack Roy was a comic, and he was temporarily out of comic entertainment because of also some setbacks. So he was in the roofing and siding business. He later became Rodney Dangerfield, but we lived together for a while.
Wow!
And so, but the pathways were similar. You know, he wanted to be a comic, but was nervous and got in trouble and didn't do well as in comedy, and then went on into roofing and siding and ripped off the world doing that for a while. And I worked with him in roofing and siding, then we lived together. So there's and all of that was part of the exposure to both musicians, comics, entertainers, you know, Lenny Bruce, and so all the there's that whole side of my life which had to do with.
Did you know Kerouac and
yes,
you knew all these? Yeah. This is so. I mean, because what I'm saying is you were developing your own sound with your horn.
Right.
Then you were going back for these degrees, and you realized that you had to be creative within being a doctor. I mean, you had to find different ways. But I mean, there was so much vibrancy in your peer group. I mean, that to me is...
Well, you can call it a peer group, but that...
Generation, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that wouldn't characterize it correctly. What happened, I'm living in New York, I'm doing what I'm doing, and I had this exposure to all of these people and formed a number of relationships over the years in people in show business and among musicians and so on. So I was very deep in that whole scene, and even to this day, even though many of them have passed now, you know, what it really reflected was the various sides of myself. You know what I mean? For example, while I was in graduate school and living with Dangerfield, every night while he was working on trying to get himself back into being a stand-up comic, he was a prolific joke writer, and the way he would finally select the material is that he would just do it. You know, he would stand up, he'd do the joke. How does this sound? You do the line. So I'd spend every night. I was in graduate school at Columbia as well as doing roofing and siding with him at night, and then when we'd come home in the apartment, he would then say he would run some material past me. You know, on this. One of the reasons I had a kind of qualification for that because my brother was a stand-up comic, you know, in the field. He knew my brother and so on. So I would sit like I'm sitting now, and he would run some lines. And what he really wanted is, you know, what is the real deal? Is this funny? Is that funny? So every line was funny. His name was Jack Roy. So Jack Roy. Every line, I said, it's funny, Jack. but it's not you. So.
Meaning, what is that? He was
well,
trying to comp somebody else, or
No. He was doing. What I meant by that is that he was doing very typical comic writing, which is to tell jokes and make sure the joke was funny. That was the generation in the development of American comedy, stand-up comedy, where it was not personal. It was just the idea it was funny. You know, it was as a stand-up comic. So everybody's material could be interchangeable.
Yeah.
But what I was reacting to is, you know, Jack, and we're coming toward the end of that phase in comedy, and I was pointing out, because I had these same interactions with my brother and I had concerns about what his limitations were. The distinctive voice was the idea, which came out of my music life, the distinctive voice. And the issue was, well, Jack, why don't you, you know, you need a theme. You need some kind of a theme. So those conversations went on, and I'll give you a punchline on that in a moment, but it turns out the fact that I was doing that with him, then a lot of other comics would come up to the apartment.
Really?
Yeah, and they would do the same. They'd do the audition with me again. And so I got a little reputation, you know, as a graduate student there. So the first doctoral reputation I had was an act doctor. So they called me the act doctor.
The act doctor.
The act doctor. They would come up like this in a room and just do their thing.
And because your brother was doing it, you had the
that
credibility.
gave me my qualification.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I had a brother in show, but he was already out of town, and I'm now just doing this with. Now, what's important about that for me anyway was that this is in my 20s. It was reaffirming my inner ear about, you know, this issue of a distinctive voice, which was always the issue also for me in jazz music, and remains the issue in jazz, the distinctive voice. For me, what's pleasing is, or really important, is when an individual's voice, musical voice, is recognizable to me, you know, and finding your own voice. And it's true also, I believe, in all art, and it turns out to be true, and I've felt in comedy. So, as later on, of course, what Jack developed, or Rodney Dangerfield developed, was I get no respect. So the theme, so I'm a guy who gets no respect. And that defined the kind of personality theme to all his materials. And you're not just doing any joke, although you can convert any joke into this theme, you know what I mean? That makes you distinctive.
How, bringing it into Amity Foundation, Circle Tree Ranch,
how much do you try to implore with younger peeps who are struggling with addiction about finding their individual voice to become more liberated?
When you ask this question now, you're now really talking about the real commitment we have to make if we're talking about helping people change their lives. They start out with, let's say, a deep problem like addiction, or they start out being totally lost in life and being deviant in life. It's far away from the elegant question of, let's find your inner voice, you know what I mean? You first have to help them essentially get back to being alive and learning how to live right for a little while. They can't get to an inner voice as long as you're acting off.
You're absolutely 100% right.
So the key, and this was the central issue around addiction. As long as you're taking drugs, you're never going to know who you are. You're never going to know what you really feel. You're never going to know the meaning of your own life.
You think all drugs like that?
Well, any substance that essentially begins to become any kind of a compulsive disorder for you. And so we can define the threshold for that. It's a fair question, but beginning with the proposition that people who get involved in addictive disorders or eating disorders, once you're acting out, you can't get to anything like the inner voice in life, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that you're changing the nervous system, you're blocking that process in that way. And you have to basically, to find out who you are, you first have to be clear-headed, and your nervous system has to be free of all contaminants in this. Some of my colleagues over the years have had an opposite view, that they see some drugs as expansive and enhancive, right? You know, in terms of the psychedelic drugs, you know, as adding something to that. I don't want to get into too much of an academic discussion.
No, this is absolutely, I mean, this is absolutely phenomenal. We don't have to go there, but I mean,
I just did an interview with a guy, Krishna Das, who was with Ram Dass.
Mm-hmm, right.
You know, so Ram Dass was ultimately seeking a
a state of consciousness and without having LSD, and ultimately he went to India and worked under Maharaji. But we can talk about that another time.
You're right.
Okay. So this is the question: you get cats that are now they are through these phases of they've weaned themselves off
right
addiction, and they are now searching for a path. That's when the inner voice. How have you helped cats help? What would be your advice for people who are at a point now where they're out of the darkness and they are looking to the light to find their individual voice?
Well, look, it's a broad question that you're asking, but I'll bring it back to the actual work, and it may give you a workable response to what you're asking. In drug rehabilitation, places like Amity, and the approach that Amity takes, which is basically a therapeutic community approach. I don't know how much you've been reading on this or getting some context for this, but a very distinctive approach to treating drug addiction in particular, but lifestyles in general. And in that approach, of course, the first requirement is you can't be on any kind of drugs because you can't get into step one if you're on drugs. You first have to stop, and then you'll find out why you even were using. So beginning with that, you say, all right, once individuals have gotten away from and moved past step one in terms of surrendering their drug use, how do they find authenticity for themselves? Now is the real struggle. And the teaching in therapeutic communities has centered around the idea that individuals have to live absolutely honestly and openly, and they have to teach each other to live honestly and openly. Every action, every word has got to be essentially honest. What's your honest feelings, what's your honest thoughts. There's much more to talk about in terms of how people have to treat each other with respect and so on, but in terms of getting at the core change that has to happen to them so they can get back to themselves is complete, absolute honesty. And helping each other in the kind of a therapeutic community approach, it is an approach which focuses on helping each other see what is false about one another. See, and in this sense, it's the ultimate mutual self-help. I need you to see me, and you need me to see you. And once individuals can absolutely begin adhering to that is learning how to be absolutely honest, it's the first, they've passed the first requirement in finding themselves. Because the issue now is no more images, no more social images, which are false, but they're really, what do you really feel and what do you really think? And practicing, literally learning those as personal skills in life is a requirement to get you to the next step in terms of, well, what do I want to do? What satisfies me most? What is it that I can really give my life over to? You can't get there if you don't have absolute honesty.